Hello, everyone. We are following the sentence of R.Kelly in a Chicago federal courtroom. 20 years, 19 to be served at the same time that he serves a 30-year sentence that was handed down in New York. This is for sexual abuse, 1 year consecutive, which means that's in effect adding 1 year to the sentence that he already received in New York.
That Chicago charge, and when he was convicted, that was in September of last year. So we waited all this time. Then this morning at 9:45, the sentencing hearing began. It was a morning full of victim impact statements. Then the judge handing down that decision just a few minutes ago. We want to check in with our Charlie DeMar. He is there in the courthouse to give us a sense of what things are like in there. Obviously, a ton of media attention, Charlie. What can you share with us?
And Jim and Marie, as you said, essentially a 31-year sentence, an additional year tacked on to his 30-year sentence that came down from a federal judge in New York. We are downstairs at the Dirksen Federal Building. Our Tara Molina is upstairs in the courtroom. She'll be down in a few minutes to provide some color of R.Kelly's reactions when that sentence came down. But right now, as you can see behind me, there's just a ton of media here. We are waiting for the prosecutors to come down. We expect them to give a statement, and also R.Kelly's defense attorneys who fought for a lighter sentence. Kelly's attorneys, they wanted closer to a 10-year sentence, and prosecutors in this case, obviously, they wanted closer to 90, which was the maximum in this case. And you mentioned it before, Marie, but today he was sentenced on convictions for child pornography and enticement of minors for sex. Those charges stem from sex abuse with his goddaughter, who was referred to throughout this trial simply as Jane. Again, prosecutors, they wanted a 25-year sentence, rather, for this to be served in addition to his 30 years. So federal prosecutors got far from what they wanted, with only one additional year being tacked on to his sentence that he got in New York. If you remember that New York case, those were convictions for federal racketeering and sex trafficking. Again, about a 31-year sentence. We do expect to hear from both federal prosecutors and defense attorneys. And when the judge was giving down his sentence today, the judge laid out what he was factoring. We, of course, heard impact statements from some of R. Kelly's victims who said their lives are forever changed, that they're unable to maintain relationships with significant others, all from what happened, but what was done to them by Robert Kelly when they were just young girls, minors. But the judge laid it out to the court, saying that no matter what he does, no matter what sentence that he gives down, that R. Kelly is not going to get out the door after today, and that he has a life expectancy of, quote, not of a whole hell lot more. Meaning that after the 30 years, R. Kelly's 56, that's in his 80s, that if he does go along, and follows with good behavior and everything else, wouldn't get out until he is in his 80s. So the judge said life expectancy in prison really is a relevant factor, and that's kind of what was on the table today. If the judge handed down a consecutive sentence, which would have had to be served, on top of the New York sentence, again, just 1 year, or if he was to hand down a sentence that ran concurrently at the same time as that New York sentence, which really the judge sided with R. Kelly's team in this case by only adding on just a single year to his sentence, guys.
Charlie, thank you so much. We'll check back in with you. We want to make one note as far as while we wait for these attorneys to come downstairs and give us their thoughts. According to our producer, Todd Fuhrer, who's in the newsroom, or in the courtroom rather, they're now discussing the issue of restitution, if any of Kelly's victims will get restitution. So that's currently being discussed in the courtroom right now.
We are pleased to be joined by Renato Mariotti. He is an attorney and a former federal prosecutor. Renato, thank you. What is your reaction to this sentence?
Well, I have a couple thoughts. So first of all, Judge Lineweber is always very fair-minded. I'm not surprised that he tried to take both sides' arguments into account here. But one thing that I think is important for our viewers here to keep in mind is that this sentence, while yes, it's only 1 year longer than the sentence that was handed down in New York, it's an important backstop, because the New York case, in my judgment, was weaker legally than the Chicago case. And so now, from the R. Kelly camp, if they want to try to beat that charge and get him out of prison, they not only need to prevail on appeal in the New York case, but even if they do, they have to also prevail and beat the case here in Chicago, which I think is much more difficult to do. So I really think it's actually an important backstop to ensure that R.Kelly spends the bulk of his remaining years in prison.
Renato, this was not, though, the sentence that federal prosecutors wanted in Chicago. How disappointed might they be?
Oh, I think they're incredibly disappointed. This was frankly the stronger of the two cases. They put a lot of work into this. It's apparent from looking at the indictment here. I mean, they actually went back and charged the obstruction of justice from the original state court case that R.Kelly ended up beating, right? He ended up becoming, not guilty in that case. They brought obstruction charges there. They obviously put a lot of work and brought charges regarding a number of victims here. And I have to think not only prosecutors, but the victims in this case have to feel like they're not vindicated, because ultimately to them, I'm sure the way it looks is Judge Leinweber's sentence is saying that all of the suffering that was caused to these victims in this case is only worth an additional year.
Renato, I wanted to ask you, we were hearing from our team in the courtroom, the judge talk about this issue of his age and his health. His defense team arguing that Kelly is 56, he has diabetes, and they use that in their discussion of how much time he should get and whether it should be at the same time as the New York sentence. The judge, Leinweber said specifically that it's not something that you do lightly to sentence somebody who is an older defendant or a person who's there in front of the judge. You don't sentence them to life in prison, the rest of their life in prison, lightly. Are you surprised that he took that into account at the level that he did and chose to speak about that?
I'm not surprised. First of all, just to be clear, in federal court, and I used to be a federal prosecutor myself, worked with the prosecutors in this case, the judge has to take into account the history, the characteristics of the defendant. That includes his age, that includes his health. So I'm not surprised that Judge Leinweber took that into account. I have to say, I've had a number of cases, including high-profile cases, in front of Judge Leinweber, and he's always very fair-minded, and he is somebody who does take into account the impact of the sentence on the defendant. So I'm not surprised by it here. Obviously, there's reasons to be critical. I tried to present those a moment ago, but I do think that he's required by law to consider those factors, and obviously he took them into account here.
Former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti, thank you so much for your insight today. We appreciate it.
And stay with us, because we want to go back to you as we continue our coverage here on CBSChicago.com. Thank you, Renato. Renato just mentioned some feeling like they didn't get justice. One of R. Kelly's alleged victims, Lenita Carter, voiced her frustrations after Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx dropped their charges against the disgraced R&B singer. Fox said at the time that, we need to devote more resources to crimes, other crimes in the Chicago area throughout Cook County, considering that he has already been sentenced in New York.
Right. So we have this statement here from Lenita Carter that she shared just after the sentence was handed down. I've spent nearly 20 years hoping that my abuser would be brought to justice for what he did to me. With today's announcement, all hope of justice for my case is gone. That is something Renato just touched on, and it's a feeling that she voiced today in court.
Let's go back to Charlie DeMar. He's in what they call the bullpen at the Dirksen Federal Courthouse. Charlie?
And Jim and Marie, still in sort of the same spot as we were last time when we checked in, waiting for prosecutors and R. Kelly's defense team to come down and give their statements. As you just heard from our guest a few moments ago, this really sounds like a victory for Team R. Kelly in this, as federal prosecutors wanted much more in this case. But to backtrack a little bit, when you touched on Kim Foxx dropping the state charges against R. Kelly, and some of her reasoning for dropping those charges was that he already was sentenced in New York for 30 years and was expecting, more time to be served, more time to be handed down in this case here, and that her office really didn't have the resources to go after this case, and that she felt that justice had been served. And a question that I asked Kim Foxx directly was, why not wait until after the sentencing to then make your decision to drop the case or move forward? And she says, we simply just don't have the resources to move forward with this case, and that she felt, in her opinion, that justice had been served with the 30-year sentence in New York and whatever was going to be handed down here today. So an interesting side note, some may ask, why didn't you wait to see if there was a sentence that, constituted justice for all victims. Because as we know, when State's Attorney Kim Foxx dropped those charges, not everyone was happy. Not everyone was pleased with that decision. But again, we are in the bullpen. It's the lobby area of the Dirksen Federal Building, just waiting for prosecutors and the defense team to come down and share their thoughts of the sentence that was handed down today.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie.
Now, Kelly's attorneys introduced the factor of race in this case. They said the white musicians who had relationships with underage girls were not prosecuted. They specifically, in their memorandum, mentioned Elvis Presley, who began a relationship with Priscilla when she was 14. There's always been some dispute about the nature of that relationship. Right. She was certainly of age when they were married in 1967.
His defense team, too, in these final statements before that sentence was handed down, talked about the sexual abuse that Kelly himself suffered and how that shaped his life and what happened since. The judge, though, saying that there's no way he's getting out. This is a horrific crime, wanting the sentence to reflect that as well. And I wanted to, if we can, we're talking about the timeline here, what led up to this. You have the New York case. You have the Chicago federal case sentenced in September, or charged rather, Kelly convicted in September of 2022. But there has been so much action. You heard Charlie talking about Kim Foxx dropping the Cook County case against Kelly. That was on January 30th. And just last week, Kelly's team requested a new trial in this case. They were claiming that two of the witnesses lied under oath. One of them, they said, was accuser, was a star witness, Jane. The other that they accused of lying under oath was an expert. This was a licensed clinical forensic psychologist who talked a little bit about Kelly's mindset. Now, the federal judge denied that, but it speaks to how much his team was still trying to work to try to get this reset and give it another shot, if you will, just a week before the sentence was handed down.
And of course, we have to say that this has been a long saga for R.Kelly. You might recall that it was 15 years ago, 2008. He was acquitted in state court here in Cook County. He was acquitted on one charge in this federal case here in Chicago, that he and others conspired to rig his Cook County trial 15 years ago.
The big questions today were always, will the sentence be run at the same time as the New York sentence, or will it be on top of that? We have that answer now. Again, 1 year on top of New York's 30 years, and then 19 years to be served at the same time. The other question is, will restitution be awarded to any of Kelly's victims? We understand that is what that discussion is happening in the courtroom right now. That's why we haven't seen the attorneys yet come down to share their thoughts on this sentencing. But that is the next big question that we hope to have an answer to sometime soon.
We can never forget the role that a very persistent journalist, Jim DeRogatis, played in so much of this. You know, there were the pleas that people were not taking the sexual abuse, Kelly's sexual abuse of children, seriously, and Jim DeRogatis of the Sun-Times and later other publications persisted and continued to report on the alleged abuse at the hands of R. Kelly. And as a result, we see what is happening in court here in Chicago today and what happened in New York. Let's go back to Charlie in the bullpen. Charlie?
And guys, along the lines of the restitution argument here, you know, a big factor is that that R. Kelly's defense attorneys made here is that he doesn't have much money left. You know, estimates before all of this, all of the legal troubles that he was facing, that R. Kelly's fortune was somewhere around $1 billion, but that has since been depleted over the years, not only with his lifestyle, but also all of the legal battles that he has faced. So even if restitution is demanded by a judge, the victims likely aren't likely to see much money in this case. So while it is an argument, a judge certainly has the right to hand it, force restitution or order restitution. In reality, the victims are unlikely to see any of that money, especially with R. Kelly not making a dollar in the last several years, and as he now will be behind bars for at least 31 years. But again, we are in the bullpen waiting for updates from federal prosecutors who were pushing for close to more than 2 decades behind bars, and only an additional year will be tacked on to that New York sentence.
Thank you.
We're pleased to be joined on the line by Jim DeRogatis. No journalist has done more to bring R. Kelly's crimes to light than Jim DeRogatis, the veteran journalist. His book is called Soulless: The Case Against R.Kelly. Jim, your reaction to the sentence today?
Well, it's mixed. I mean, 20 years additional, but consecutive and only 1 year to be served after the sentence in New York. It's kind of an insult to the prosecution that laid out a tremendous amount of very harrowing evidence. Those videos, anyone who saw them will never forget them. And, you know, the main victim from the 2008 case, her life was ruined. The victim impact statements were incredibly powerful. I think Judge Leinenweber is sending a message that the federal government from the beginning should have consolidated the cases, the Chicago federal case and the Brooklyn federal case, into one case. But you have to still look at it. No one in the history of popular music, where men have been mistreating women for a very long time, has ever been sentenced to life in prison effectively, as Kelly is.
Jim, we heard from Lenita Carter, and we know that there are other victims who were a part of the Cook County cases that State's Attorney Kim Foxx dropped. Even with this sentence today, they are expressing that frustration. They feel that justice will not be served on their behalf. I know you were so in touch with the victim's voice. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know how the dozens of victims who were never heard in court, not in New York, not in Chicago, how they ever feel like they will have justice. There are, 69 women whose names I know. We heard from a total of about 25 and 2 young men in these 2 federal cases. The damage this man wrought over 30 years, because his abuse goes from 1991 until the day he was arrested in 2019, has left so many bodies, ruined lives, the female victims, of course, and their families in his wake. I don't think Chicago has even begun to grapple with the enormity of his crimes, but 31 years in prison is a heck of a sentence, even if it only was 1 additional year added in Chicago.
Jim, you did extensive reporting on this long before charges were brought against R. Kelly. Why did it take so long?
You know this, my friend. Black women don't matter. This is what I heard again and again and again from these young victims. Very first victim who stepped forward, Tiffany Hawkins, initially went to the Cook County State's Attorney, and they had no interest in pressing a case in criminal court all the way back in '96, and so she turned to the civil courts. I'm just amplifying those voices from the Black community who told me again and again, we were young Black girls who cared.
In this sentence, Jim, is there a broader message? We talked about what the federal government is trying to say at large, but to the victims, to people, to anyone who might have interacted with him, what does 31 years say?
Well, I think, what I have heard from those who testified, who spoke to me, not all of them did, is they're glad they were finally believed in a court of law. The many others who were never heard on the stand, have mixed feelings. But I think everybody should take a deep breath and, as I said, realize that no predator in the history of popular music, entertainment in general, has ever, faced effectively a life sentence in prison, 31 years. He's 56 today. If they give him a time served already, he's still got like 27 years to go.
Jim DeRogatis, we thank you for all the work that you've done, and we thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Jim.
Of course.
Thank you, Jim.
We now want to go to Attorney Tamara Walker. She is joining us to give her perspective on this sentencing. Tamara, do we have you?
Hi, good afternoon.
Thank you for being with us. Right off the bat, your reaction to this sentencing today.
It was exceeded what the what the state was looking for, what the government was looking for. And as Jim DeRosatis mentioned, it is in excess of anything we've ever seen from any celebrity recording artist, from any Hollywood star. So what we take from this is this: it's a message. We're saying that we as a society will not tolerate these types of actions. Some may view it as excessive. He certainly, it seems, will not see the light of day unless he's successful on appeal. So this sends a loud, resounding message, and hopefully the victims can find some solace.
And yet, Tamara, the prosecutors were asking for more. They want a longer consecutive sentence. What is your reaction to that in that light?
You know, that is an evaluation that the judge has to make. So the consecutive sentence comes in where a judge finds the conduct to be particularly egregious, which here I think most people would agree that the conduct that he was convicted of is particularly egregious. However, you also have to look at other factors. And I think the judge took into account his age right now. It's unlikely that he will ever see the light of day. He'll be like 100, I believe, or over 100 at the conclusion of these sentences, or I believe 80 at the latest, or at the least. So you have to look at it in that light, and it becomes a piling on at a certain point. So you have an individual, never see the light of day, victims are vindicated, and that is justice in this instance.
Tamara, Judge Leinenweber mentioned at one point that he believed if the Chicago federal case went ahead of time, ahead of the New York case, that the sentence would have been higher if this case had gone first before New York. I thought that was interesting to know. They blamed it on COVID and timing. Would you see that it makes sense that whatever that first case was going to be was really going to set the table, and then anything else would be that piling on?
That's exactly right. That's often what happens when someone is charged in multiple jurisdictions or in multiple cases. You often look to that first case to set the tone as to what happens. So I think that what happened here is completely in line with that. It's hard, you know, you can always theorize and say if this has happened first, but I will say this. With Mr. Kelly being from the Chicago area, with there being so many points of contact here in Chicago, I think it is very likely, given that amount of contact, given the amount of history, given the amount of years here, given the way a lot of people felt about how the state trial ended, if we're going to take the whole situation into play, then I think that it's completely a logical leap to say that he may have faced more time had it happened here first. Absolutely.
Tamara Walker, an attorney, joining us today, giving us her perspective on the sentencing of R.Kelly in this federal case. Thank you so much for your time, Tamara. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you for having me. Yes.
Let's go back to Charlie DeMar. He is at the Dirksen Courthouse. Charlie?
Hey guys, yeah, we are still in the bullpen waiting for updates from federal prosecutors, defense attorneys in this case. Artera Molina still in the courtroom. We're hoping once she comes down, she'll be able to give us a little more color of what went on when the sentence was handed down, from R.Kelly's reaction to federal prosecutors, who of course are hoping for a much stiffer sentence than just the additional 1 year that was tacked on to the 30 years that were handed down in a separate federal case out of New York that was on sex trafficking and racketeering charges. But as you've heard some of our guests say, that the judge really had to take a lot into consideration, and his age and health were certainly factors. R.Kelly is 56 years old. Tack on another 30 years. It won't be until his 80s that he's even eligible for release, that he has suffered from a number of health conditions, I believe diabetes among them. And of course, life expectancy in prison is not the same as it is outside of those bars. So a lot of factors for this judge, and he even laid it out to the court, saying that no matter what he does, Mr. Kelly is not going out the door today, and that he has a life expectancy of not a lot more once he serves this 31-year sentence. So he said he may outlive it, he may not outlive it, and that's of course a very hard decision. You essentially are putting someone's life in your hands. That judge was tasked with that responsibility today, and weighing all these factors in, of course, wanting to give a fit punishment for the crime, to serve justice that would be fitting for the victims in this case, but also taking in all of those considerations for R. Kelly as a human being and all that goes into that. So a lot was there, and the judge said death in prison should not be taken lightly, and it's clear today that he didn't. He did not take that lightly by only adding on another year. A good point, and we will certainly ask both federal prosecutors and defense attorneys, a point that Jim DeRogatis brought up was the judge trying to send a message, make a point that these cases, the one here in Illinois and the one in New York, should have been consolidated rather than going through this process two separate times and using all of the federal resources that come with a federal trial to put these two cases on. So we will certainly present that question. Obviously, you never know what you're going to get, what response you'll get from a federal prosecutor. You assume that they're going to stand by their decision to try this case separately here in Illinois and just focus on the victims here in Illinois, opposed to those charges in New York. But you never know, what they might be feeling right now. But certainly, those federal prosecutors have to be stinging a little bit going out of that courtroom. Because they wanted a much stiffer sentence in this case, guys.
Charlie DeMar at the courthouse, thanks so much. And we have just heard from our producer, Todd Fuhrer, that the sentencing hearing is now over.
That means we do expect our Tara Molina to come down out of the courtroom and give us a sense of what it was like in there as this sentence was handed down. But there was a bit of business. It was the last thing to do as part of this hearing, and that is restitution. We have that information from our producer, Todd. We understand that the judge has awarded $42,000. You see these tweets here right on your screen. In restitution to Pauline, but no restitution to Jane or Nia. These are three names used by these victims who have testified and gone after Kelly. So the reason the judge agreed to this money just for Pauline, it says Nia has already received a settlement in a lawsuit against Kelly. Jane has not said that she's seeking any mental health treatment. Prosecutors object, but the judge said the victims can still sue Kelly. This was after prosecutors said that these women's lives have been irrevocably changed and they are needing support. So again, restitution awarded in the number of $42,000 to one of these victims.
And a couple of other points that were mentioned today in court, as reported by our producer, Todd Fuhrer. Robert Kelly's attorney asking that Kelly not be placed on suicide watch because he's not suicidal, according to his attorney, but the judge says that decision is left up to the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
We continue to wait as the hearing is now over. We hope these attorneys will be coming downstairs and speaking to our cameras. You saw Charlie DeMar there in position, waiting to hear their reaction to today's sentencing. We will be bringing you that here on CBS News Chicago, streaming all afternoon as soon as it happens.
We'll send you back now. Thank you.